The year was 2347, and humanity had finally done what their ancestors had dreamed about for thousands of years. They had reached the stars. They had built colonies across 14 different star systems, and they had created a small but proud civilization among the endless darkness of space. Earth was no longer alone. Humans lived on distant worlds with strange skies and alien suns. They had proven that they belonged out here in the universe. When the message arrived from the Galactic Concord, the leaders of Earth believed it was the greatest moment in all of human history. The Concord was an alliance of 37 ancient species who had ruled the galaxy for over 50,000 years. They controlled millions of star systems. They commanded fleets that numbered in the millions. They were the true masters of everything between the spiral arms. And now they were inviting humanity to join them. The United Earth Council chose their best people for this mission. Ambassador Daniel was a calm and patient man from a small town in Kansas. He had spent 30 years settling disputes between nations, and he had never raised his voice in anger. He believed that every problem could be solved with enough patience and understanding. Admiral Moore was a decorated officer who had commanded ships in 3 different conflicts. She was known for her steady nerves and her ability to remain calm when others panicked. Dr. Samuel Grant was an old professor who had dedicated his entire life to studying alien languages and cultures. He had learned to speak 11 non-human languages, and he understood that words meant different things to different species. These 3 boarded the starship Meridian and began the long journey to the Concord's capital station. The station was called the Eternal Spire, and it floated in the heart of the galaxy where the stars were so thick that the sky was never truly dark. The journey took 3 months, and during that time, Daniel read everything humanity knew about the Concord. He learned about their history and their laws and their customs. He wanted to understand them so that he could speak to them as equals. When the Meridian arrived at the Eternal Spire, Daniel felt his heart fill with wonder. The station was larger than most planets. It was covered in towers and domes and structures that human understanding. Ships from 1,000 different species moved around it like insects around a hive. This was the center of galactic civilization. This was where the fate of worlds was decided. The welcome they received was not what Daniel had hoped for. Most of the alien species ignored the humans completely. Some looked at them with open disgust. The tall beings made of living crystal who served as the Concord's diplomats informed Daniel that humanity would have to wait 6 months before their case would be heard. This was standard procedure for primitive species, they explained. Daniel accepted this with grace even though it stung. Wanted to argue, but Daniel told her to be patient. They had come too far to ruin things with pride. During those 6 months of waiting, Samuel Grant studied everything he could about the species around them. He noticed strange things. There was a rigid order to everything. The oldest species gave commands and the younger species obeyed without question. There was no debate. There was no discussion. The strong ruled and the weak served. Samuel wrote all of this in his notes, and he shared his concerns with Daniel late at night when they were alone. When the day finally came for humanity to stand before the High Assembly, Daniel dressed in his finest clothes and walked into a chamber that could hold 1,000,000 people. The High Assembly was made up of 12 elder species who controlled all the major decisions of the Concord. They sat on platforms high above the floor, and they looked down at the 3 humans like giants examining insects. The speaker was a being named. His crystal body glowed with soft blue light and his voice rang like bells when he spoke. He welcomed humanity to the Concord, and he presented the terms of membership. He made it sound like a gift. He made it sound like an honor. Daniel listened carefully as explained what humanity would receive. They would be granted protected status. They would be safe from external threats. They would have access to Concord technology and Concord trade routes. It sounded wonderful until explained what humanity would give in return. Humanity would cede control of 7 of their 14 colonies to elder species for resource extraction. The people living on those colonies would become workers for alien masters. Humanity would limit their fleet to small defensive vessels only. They would never be allowed to build warships or expand their military. All scientific research would be submitted for approval before it could continue. Certain fields of study would be forbidden entirely. The human population would be capped at a specific number and could never grow beyond it. And finally, humanity would wait 3,000 years before being considered for voting rights in the conquered. 3,000 years. That was longer than all of recorded human history. That was longer than the time between the pyramids and the present day. Generations upon generations would live and die as servants before humanity could even speak in this chamber. The assembly fell silent after finished. Every alien eye was fixed on Daniel. They were waiting for the grateful acceptance that every young species had offered before them. This was how it had always worked. The conquered offered terms and young species accepted. There was no other option. There had never been another option. Daniel looked at the document in his hands. He looked at and saw cold fury in her eyes. He looked at Samuel and saw sad understanding. The old professor had suspected something like this. He had seen it in the way the conquered treated everyone who was not ancient and powerful. Daniel thought about his home. He thought about the fields of Kansas where he had grown up. He thought about his parents who had taught him that every person deserved dignity and respect. He thought about the millions of humans who had worked and sacrificed to reach the stars. They had not come all this way to become slaves. He folded the document carefully and placed it on the table in front of him. The assembly waited in perfect silence. Daniel stood straight and looked up at the towering figures above him. His voice was calm and clear when he spoke. "These terms are unacceptable. We are leaving." He turned and walked toward the exit, and Samuel followed him. Behind them, a million alien beings sat in stunned silence. No one tried to stop them. No one knew what to do. In 50,000 years of galactic history, no species had ever refused the conquered. Until now, the chamber of the High Assembly remained frozen for a long time after the humans left. No one spoke. No one moved. The elder species who had ruled the galaxy for 50,000 years simply stared at the empty space where the three small creatures had stood. What had just happened was so far outside their understanding that their minds could not process it. Ambassador of the was the first to speak. His crystal form flickered with confused colors as he addressed his fellow council members. He suggested that there must have been a translation error. Perhaps the human language was more complex than they had assumed. Perhaps the word that sounded like refusal actually meant something else entirely. Perhaps the humans had accepted and simply expressed it in a strange way. But there had been no error. The translation systems used by the conquered had been perfected over thousands of years. They did not make mistakes. The human ambassador had said exactly what everyone heard. He had called the terms unacceptable. He had said they were leaving. And then he had walked out. High Arbiter was the oldest living being in the assembly. He came from a species so ancient that they had forgotten the name of their own. His body was withered and gray, but his eyes still held the cold intelligence of a creature who had watched civilizations rise and fall. He leaned forward on his platform, and his voice ground out like stones scraping together. He told the assembly that the humans did not understand. They could not understand. They were young and foolish, and they did not know the way of things. Every species that reached the stars eventually stood before the conquered. Every species received terms. Every species accepted. This was not cruelty. This was order. This was how peace was maintained across a galaxy of countless worlds and countless peoples. The representative rose from his platform. There were massive beings with armored shells and razor-sharp mandibles. They served as the military arm of the conquered, and they had crushed more rebellions than anyone could count. The representative clicked his mandibles together in a sound that translated as dark amusement. He said that if the humans did not understand words, then they would understand force. They would be happy to explain things more clearly. But raised a hand for silence. He was not ready for that yet. He wanted to understand what had happened. He wanted to know why the humans had done something that no species had ever done before. While the assembly debated, the three humans boarded their ship and prepared to leave the Eternal Spire. Moore stood on the bridge and watched the massive station grow smaller through the viewport. Her hands were shaking slightly, but not from fear. She was angry. She was angrier than she had ever been in her life. Those arrogant creatures had looked at humanity and seen nothing but potential servants. They had offered slavery dressed up in pretty words and expected grateful thanks in return. Daniel sat alone in his quarters and stared at his hands. He knew what he had done. He knew that he might have just doomed his entire species. The Conquered had millions of ships. They had weapons that could shatter planets. Humanity had nothing compared to their power. By any rational measure, he should have accepted the terms. He should have bought humanity time to grow stronger. He should have played the long game. But he could not do it. When he looked at those terms, when he read the words that would reduce his people to servants for 3,000 years, something inside him had refused. It was not a decision made by logic. It was something deeper, something that told him that some prices were too high to pay even for survival. Samuel Grant found Daniel in his quarters and sat down across from him. The old professor did not speak for a long time. He simply sat with his friend and shared the weight of what they had done. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentle. He told Daniel that he had studied alien cultures his entire life. He had learned their languages and their histories and their ways of thinking. And in all his studies, he had noticed something that troubled him. Every species that joined the Conquered eventually became the same. They lost their uniqueness. They lost their fire. They became obedient and quiet and empty. The Conquered did not just demand submission. It consumed everything that made a species special. Daniel looked at his old friend and asked if he thought they had made the right choice. Samuel smiled sadly and said he did not know, but he knew that the humans who would have accepted those terms would not have been human anymore. Some things were worth dying for. Dignity was one of them. The news of what happened spread across the Eternal Spire within hours. Diplomats from dozens of species gathered in small groups and whispered about the impossible thing the humans had done. Some laughed at the foolishness of the young species. Some shook their heads at the waste of potential. But some watched the departing human ship with something strange in their eyes, something that might have been hope. There were energy beings who had existed since before most stars were born. They rarely spoke, and they never interfered in the affairs of physical creatures. But one of them appeared before High Arbiter in his private chambers after the assembly ended. It flickered with colors that no human eye could see, and it asked a simple question. It asked what would happen now. Told that the humans would learn. The Conquered would send diplomats with better offers. The humans would see reason. And if they did not see reason, then they would teach them what happened to species that the natural order. The flickered again and asked another question. It asked if it was certain that things would go according to the old patterns. It reminded him that in 50,000 years no species had ever refused. Perhaps this meant something. Perhaps the humans were different in ways the Conquered did not understand. Dismissed with a wave of his ancient hand. He had seen young species before. He had seen their pride and their defiance and their belief that they were special. They all learned eventually. The galaxy was too big and the Conquered was too strong. The humans would bend or they would break. There was no third option. But as the faded away, felt something he had not felt in 10,000 years. It was small and cold, and it sat in the pit of his stomach like a stone. It took him a moment to recognize it because it had been so long since he had experienced such a thing. It was doubt. The Conquered believed that the situation would resolve itself quickly. They had dealt with stubborn species before. Pride was common among young civilizations. They all believed they were special. They all believed they could challenge the ancient order, and they all learned the truth soon enough. Diplomats from 12 different species were sent to human space with revised offers. Each offer was slightly better than the last. The waiting period for voting rights was reduced from 3,000 years to 2,000. The number of colonies to be surrendered was reduced from 7 to 5. Small concessions were made on population limits and research restrictions. The conquered was being generous. The conquered was being patient. Surely the humans would see reason. Ambassador Lisa Warren handled the negotiations from Earth. She was a woman with gray eyes and a quiet voice who had learned diplomacy in the hardest schools humanity had to offer. She received each delegation politely. She listened to their offers carefully, and she rejected each one with the same calm firmness that Daniel had shown at the Eternal Spire. The humans wanted equal partnership or nothing at all. They would not surrender colonies. They would not limit their fleet. They would not submit their research for approval. They would not accept population caps. They would not wait thousands of years to be heard. They would be treated as equals or they would stand alone. The conquered diplomats could not understand this position. They tried to explain that humanity was small and weak and new to the stars. They tried to explain that the conquered had existed for 50,000 years and would exist for 50,000 more. They tried to explain that submission was not shameful. It was simply the natural order. The strong led and the weak followed. This was how the galaxy worked. Lisa Warren smiled politely and told them that this was not how humanity worked. Then she escorted them back to their ships. 3 months after the walkout at the Eternal Spire, the Dominion finally lost patience. They had waited long enough for diplomacy to solve the problem. Now they would solve it their way. 200,000 warships mobilized along the border of human space. It was the largest fleet assembled in over 1,000 years. It carried enough firepower to reduce every human colony to ash and glass within a matter of days. The message from the fleet commander was simple and brutal. General was a veteran of 60 campaigns. He had crushed rebellions on worlds that no longer existed. He had broken species that now served the conquered as laborers and servants. He gave humanity one standard day to surrender unconditionally. If they did not surrender, they would advance and they would not stop until every human world was burning. Admiral Brooks received the message on the bridge of his flagship. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and calm brown eyes. He had commanded ships since he was 25 years old and he had never lost a battle. But he had also never faced odds like this. Humanity had 1,100 ships. They had 200,000. The mathematics of the situation were absolutely clear. Resistance was suicide. Looked at the tactical display showing the massive enemy fleet. He looked at his officers who stood silent around him. He thought about his wife back on Earth and his 2 daughters who were just starting school. He thought about all the people on all the human worlds who were counting on him to keep them safe. Then he gave his orders. The human fleet would hold position at the border. They would not retreat. They would not surrender. They would wait. His officers looked at him with something between fear and wonder. One of them asked what they should tell the crew, thought about it for a moment, and then he told them to tell the crew the truth. They were probably going to die. But they were going to die standing up instead of kneeling down. That had to count for something. General received the human response with confusion. It was a single sentence broadcast on all channels. It said only 4 words: "Come and take them." The general had expected many things. He had expected surrender. He had expected negotiation. He had expected desperate pleas for mercy. He had not expected defiance. He had not expected a tiny fleet to challenge his armada without any hope of victory. It made no sense. It violated every rule of warfare that he had learned in his centuries of service. Ordered his fleet to advance. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. His instincts were screaming at him in ways they never had before. He had crushed 60 rebellions and every single one had followed the same pattern. The enemy realized they could not win and they folded. That was how rational beings behaved. That was how the galaxy worked. But the humans were not folding. They were not running. They were simply waiting with their tiny fleet arranged in perfect formation. They knew they could not win. They had to know. The numbers were overwhelming, and yet there they were. requested clarification from the High Assembly. He sent detailed reports on the situation. He asked for guidance. For 6 days, his fleet held position at the edge of human space while messages flew back and forth across the galaxy. On the 7th day, the order came. The fleet was to withdraw. No explanation was given. No justification was offered. 200,000 warships simply turned around and flew away from the border. Brooks watched them go on his tactical display. He did not celebrate. He did not cheer. He simply sat in his command chair and tried to understand what had just happened. His fleet had been outnumbered almost 200 to 1. By every measure of military logic, they should have been destroyed. And yet the enemy had retreated without firing a single shot. Across the galaxy, observers noted what had happened. The mightiest military force in known space had blinked first. The who had crushed countless rebellions had backed down from a species that barely counted as a footnote in galactic history. No one understood why, no one could explain it, but everyone saw it happen. And for the first time in 50,000 years, the galaxy began to wonder if the old rules still applied. In the years that followed the withdrawal, humanity became the most studied species in the entire galaxy. Scholars and scientists and philosophers from 100 different worlds dedicated themselves to understanding what had happened. They analyzed every recording from the Eternal Spire. They studied every transmission from the human fleet. They built models and ran simulations and wrote papers that were read on millions of planets. They all wanted to answer the same question. Why had the humans refused to surrender when surrender was the only logical choice? Dr. Pierce was a human anthropologist who had spent 5 years living among alien species after the confrontation. She had traveled to dozens of worlds and interviewed thousands of beings who had watched the events unfold. When she returned to Earth, she published a paper that would change how the galaxy understood humanity. She explained that most intelligent species in the galaxy had evolved in similar ways. They had developed on worlds where cooperation with dominant powers was essential for survival. Their ancestors had learned to recognize when they were outmatched and to submit before they were destroyed. This was not cowardice. It was biological wisdom. It was the reason their species had survived long enough to reach the stars. Humans had evolved differently. On Earth, they had never been the strongest creatures. They had never been the fastest or the most deadly. They had survived through stubbornness and creativity and an almost irrational refusal to accept defeat. Their entire history was filled with stories of smaller forces standing against larger ones. Sometimes they won. Sometimes they lost. But they almost never simply gave up because the numbers said they should. This was not logical by galactic standards. It was not rational by the calculations that every other species used. But it was deeply human. It was woven into their very nature in ways that they themselves did not fully understand. Concluded her paper with a warning for the conquered. She wrote that humans could not be intimidated into submission because the part of their brain that was supposed to recognize overwhelming force and trigger surrender simply did not work the same way. Threatening them only made them more determined. Showing them impossible odds only made them more stubborn. The conquered had spent 50,000 years perfecting a system that worked on every species they had ever encountered. That system would not work on humanity. The paper spread across the galaxy like fire. It was translated into thousands of languages. It was debated in academic halls and government chambers and military command centers, and it terrified everyone who read it. Captain Christopher Lane commanded a small patrol vessel near the border of human space during those years. He was a young officer with red hair and freckles who had grown up dreaming of exploring the stars. Now, he spent most of his time watching alien ships that came to watch him. Every day, vessels from a dozen different species would approach the border. They never crossed into human space. They never made hostile moves. They simply observed. Christopher could see them on his sensors, hanging in the darkness like curious ghosts. Sometimes they stayed for hours. Sometimes they stayed for days. Then they would leave without ever sending a single message. Christopher reported these encounters to his superiors, and they told him to do nothing. The aliens were not threatening. They were studying. The entire galaxy was trying to understand what humanity was. Meanwhile, something else was happening far from the border. Secret communications began arriving at the United Earth Council from representatives of species that had been members of the Conquered for thousands of years. These messages were encrypted and hidden and sent through channels that were supposed to be impossible to trace. They all asked the same thing. They wanted to know if humanity would accept allies. Melissa Turner was the Secretary of External Affairs, and she handled these inquiries with extreme care. She understood what they meant. There were species out there who had chafed under Conquered rule for longer than humanity had existed. They had submitted because they believed there was no other choice. They had accepted their place in the hierarchy because resistance seemed impossible. But now they had seen something that changed everything. They had seen a species say no. They had seen the withdraw without firing a shot. They had seen the impossible become possible. Melissa did not rush to accept these offers of alliance. She knew that the Conquered was watching and that any wrong move could trigger the war that humanity had barely avoided. But she also knew that something fundamental had shifted. Humanity had become more than just a small species on the edge of known space. They had become a symbol. High Arbiter understood this better than anyone. He spent many long nights in his chambers staring at reports about human activity and human culture and human history. He studied their wars and their revolutions and their endless struggles against tyranny. He watched recordings of their art and their music and their stories, and slowly he began to understand what made them so dangerous. It was not their technology. It was not their military power. It was not their numbers or their resources or their strategic position. It was the idea they represented. For 50,000 years, the Conquered had maintained order through one simple belief. Resistance was futile. Submission was inevitable. The strong ruled and the weak served, and there was no point in fighting against this truth. Every species accepted it eventually. Every species learned their place. But the humans had proven that the belief was wrong. They had shown that resistance was possible. They had demonstrated that a small species could look at overwhelming power and simply refuse to kneel. And now that idea was spreading. Knew that ideas were more dangerous than weapons. Weapons could destroy bodies. Ideas could destroy empires. The Conquered had ruled the galaxy for 50,000 years by convincing everyone that there was no alternative. Now humanity had shown that there was. And the galaxy would never be the same. 10 years had passed since Daniel walked out of the chamber of the High Assembly. In that time, the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The old order that had stood for 50,000 years was crumbling, not from war, not from conquest, but from a simple idea that had spread like wildfire across 1 trillion worlds. The idea was that refusal was possible. 3 major species had broken away from the Conquered in the first 5 years. The collective had been members for 12,000 years. The Meridian States had served the elder species for 8,000. The free worlds had submitted so long ago that they had forgotten what freedom felt like. All of them had watched humanity stand alone against impossible odds. All of them had seen the withdrawal. All of them had asked themselves the same question. If the humans can refuse, why can we not? These 3 species had approached Earth with offers of alliance. After careful negotiation, the Liberty Compact was born. It was a new organization founded on principles that the Conquered had never allowed: equal partnership, mutual respect, shared defense. No species would rule over another. No species would submit to another. Every member would have an equal voice. By the 10th year, 17 more species had applied for membership. The Liberty Compact was growing while the Conquered was shrinking. The balance of power in the galaxy was shifting in ways that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. High Arbiter watched all of this happen with the cold despair of someone seeing their life's work fall apart. He had maintained the conquered through crisis after crisis. He had crushed rebellions and prevented wars, and kept the peace for longer than most species had existed. And now, it was all coming undone because of a handful of small creatures from an insignificant world. He requested a meeting with the human delegation. This time, he did not summon them to the eternal spire. This time, he came to Earth. His ship arrived over the blue planet on a clear spring morning. He looked down at the world that had caused so much trouble, and he tried to understand what made it special. It looked like countless other worlds he had seen: water and land and clouds and life. There was nothing remarkable about it, and yet somehow it had produced beings who had done what no one else had ever done. Daniel received him in a meeting room in Geneva. The old ambassador had aged in the past 10 years. His hair was white now, and his face was lined with the weight of everything he had carried. But his eyes were still calm and his voice was still steady. He welcomed to Earth with simple courtesy. Moore stood beside Daniel as she had stood beside him in the chamber of the High Assembly all those years ago. Her hair was gray now, but her posture was still military perfect. She watched with eyes that missed nothing. Samuel Grant was not there. The old professor had passed away 3 years earlier, but his research had formed the foundation of everything humanity had built. His understanding of alien cultures had guided their diplomacy. His wisdom had helped them navigate the dangerous waters between defiance and destruction. Looked at the two humans before him. They were so small. They were so short. They were fragile creatures who could be killed by a fall or a disease or 1,000 other things that elder species had overcome ages ago. And yet they had brought the greatest power in the galaxy to its knees. He told them that the conquered had underestimated them. He admitted that they had believed human defiance was ignorance or madness. They had not understood that it was something else entirely. Something that could not be crushed or intimidated or reasoned away. Daniel nodded and said that humanity had simply made a choice. They had decided that some things were more important than survival. Dignity was one of those things. Freedom was another. They had been willing to die rather than accept terms that reduced them to servants. Perhaps that was madness by galactic standards, but it was who they were. Told him that others were now making the same choice. Species that had submitted to the conquered for thousands of years were questioning whether they had needed to. The old order was fracturing. The peace that had lasted 50,000 years was ending. Spoke for the first time. She said that the peace described had never been true peace. It had been silence. It had been the quiet of species too afraid to speak. The conquered had not created order. It had created a prison where everyone pretended to be content because the alternative seemed impossible. Was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had brought him across the stars. He asked what the humans wanted. Daniel smiled. It was the same calm smile he had worn in the chamber of the High Assembly 10 years ago. He told that they wanted the same thing they had always wanted: partnership, equality. A seat at the table instead of a place beneath it. The conquered could join the future that humanity was building, or it could watch from the outside. The choice was not theirs to make. Looked at the two humans, and he understood something that he had been refusing to accept for 10 years. The age of the conquered was ending, not because humanity had defeated them in battle, not because the Liberty Compact had grown stronger than the old alliance, but because humanity had done something far more powerful than winning a war. They had proven that the old rules were not laws of nature. They were just rules, and rules could be broken. As departed Earth, he looked back at the small blue planet one last time. He thought about everything he had seen and everything he had learned. He thought about the future that was coming whether he wanted it or not. The galaxy had been a prison for 50,000 years. The bars had not been made of metal. They had been made of belief. Everyone had believed that submission was necessary. Everyone had believed that the strong would always rule the weak. Everyone had believed that there was no alternative. And then a small species from an insignificant world had simply said no. They had shown everyone where the door was. And now the prisoners were walking free.